Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Boudreau. I'm Manomet's Donor Relations Manager. I want to thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation, The Story Behind the Story, Postel the Whimbrel. We have a fantastic panel of scientists joining us today. And in just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Monica Glacia, Manomet's Assistant Director of Shorebird Habitat Management. Monica will be moderating today's presentation. But I do want to just highlight a few things before we begin. At the bottom of your screen in your toolbar, you should see a box marked Q&A. If you don't see it, just use your mouse pointer to hover over the bottom and it should appear. And if at any point during today's presentation you have a question, just click on that Q&A box and enter it. Abby Sterling, a shorebird biologist at Manomet and one of today's panelists, is going to be monitoring the questions to make sure we get an answer for you. And if you're unable to stay for the entirety of today's presentation, we are recording it. We'll share a link to the recording in a follow-up email so you can watch it on demand or share it with others. So again, thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Monica.
Hey everybody, welcome. I'm Monica Iglesia and I work in Manomet's Shorebird Recovery Program. In celebration of World Curlew Day and Earth Day, today we're going to look at Whimbrels on the wing. Some of you may have seen this before or even scrolled through it. This is an online story that we put together to share the tracked migration of individuals. So today we're just going to look at one of these three birds, and I'm really excited to share the story with you. So this story is centered on just one whimbrel, but it's also a story about the many wonderful people that are working all along the migratory path of this bird in order to protect and serve the species and shorebirds overall. So to help us as we go and to provide the story behind the story, I'm thrilled that we have some guest experts here to join us. Joining us, we have Tim Keyes, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Andy Johnson from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and from Manomet's Shorebird Recovery Program, you have me, Alan Neidel, Abby Sterling, and Brad Wynn. So as we move through the story, we'll take breaks to talk with these experts and to learn about their efforts to support and study shorebirds, including Whimbrel. So my hope is that you leave here today. It sounds like we might be having an audio problem, so I might stop to call in. Take a brief moment. My apologies, everybody.
Hey, hold on. Let me make sure I'm muted.
All right, we are back. So my hope is that one, you can hear me today, but two, that you leave here inspired by these beautiful birds and with an increased understanding of what it takes for these individuals to survive. There are many things that divide us, but I do believe that shorebirds can weave us back together, no matter how far apart we are. So we'll start our story here in coastal Georgia on the Atlantic coast of the United States. Here, the first light of dawn is rousing a flock of whimbrel from their roost. Some of these birds have flown from the mainland offshore for more than 40 miles to sleep on this remote sand spit. They come for the seclusion, from predators, from people, and for the safety in numbers. But with dawn's first light, it will call them away from the sand spit and back to the salt marsh to begin a new day of foraging. Imagine, it's early May on the Georgia coast, and these large brown shorebirds only have a few weeks to rest and to refuel before they will heed the call and continue traveling north towards the nesting grounds. So whimbrels are a type of curlew, and they're one of the most wide-ranging shorebirds in the world. At the right time of year, whimbrel can be found foraging on the coastlines of every continent except Antarctica. You may have seen a whimbrel. They have a distinctive down-curved bill, the perfect shape to barrel into the burrows of fiddler crabs. Those are their favorite crustaceans, but they do eat a variety of invertebrates. And along the shores of South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida, they find these invertebrates in this immense coastal basin called the Georgia Bight, and it drains and floods with an enormous tide twice a day. When the tide goes out, it uncovers a vast wetland complex. Much of it is full with fiddler crabs, polychaete worms, amphipods, ghost shrimp, and small clams. These small marine creatures provide a rich banquet that fuels these hungry shorebirds on migration. Whimbrels are just one of the many kinds of shorebirds that congregate and rely on the health of this coast. And as these birds make their way between their winter homes in the tropics and their breeding grounds in the boreal and Arctic landscapes of Canada and Alaska, the Georgia Bight is one of the important links connecting a chain of sites that these birds need to survive. But lucky for them, there's a network that's working to protect and connect the sites that these birds are reliant on. The Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, it's a voluntary, non-regulatory network of public and private partners that are working to protect the most important sites for shorebirds throughout the Americas. WIZRN, as it's called, is managed by an executive office that's housed within Manomet's Shorebird Recovery Program, but the network is made up of hundreds of partners. There are now 107 WIZRN sites in 17 countries, covering almost 15 million hectares or 40 million acres of shorebird habitat across the Americas. And with the help of coastal advocacy organization 100 Miles, these 100 miles of Georgia coastline became WIZRN's 100th site in 2017. One of Manomet's biologists is Brad Wynn. He's been working in this region with partners from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources and the Center for Conservation Biology at William and Mary to better understand whimbrel migration along the coast of Georgia, but also the many other places that this species migrates to. Finding out how, when, and where birds like whimbrels migrate to as they move between breeding and wintering grounds will help us solve one of the most pressing mysteries of shorebird conservation. If we don't know what path these birds are taking and where they're stopping, how do we know what habitat is most important to protect? To help unravel this question, Brad Wynn and Tim Keyes with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources have outfitted 7 whimbrels with solar-powered transmitters. These are transmitters that birds wear like tiny backpacks, and they weigh about as much as a nickel. And in 2012, Brad and Tim tagged an adult male whimbrel on St. Simon's Island in Georgia. They named him Postel, after the creek where they found him, and they followed his movements for 3.5 years. Now, we are very fortunate today to have Tim and Brad be able to join us. So, welcome, Tim and Brad. Would you mind introducing yourself and your organization?
Sure. Brad Wynn. I am with Manomet, and I'm the Director of Shorebird Habitat Management and work with the rest of the staff on the Shorebird Recovery Program. I've been at Manomet, gosh, almost 10 years now, and had the opportunity to join in 2011. And this is a great event, and thank you for joining us. And I'm really tickled by all the staff that have been working behind the scenes to make this event happen today.
Thanks. And Tim, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Tim Keyes, a biologist with Georgia Department of Natural Resources. I've been with the state of Georgia for about 20 years and have been working on the coast for the last 10. Brad and I overlapped for a couple of years, and I've since then have been focusing on shorebirds and other coastal priority species in Georgia.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for joining us. So we have a couple questions for you. So Brad, you worked for a long time in coastal Georgia, and we've often heard you tell the story of sitting on the beach on St. Simons and watching these huge flocks of Whimbrel that are streaming out from the marshes and flying to roost offshore. Can you tell us a bit about that behavior? What was your first inkling that Georgia was an important place for Whimbrel in the springtime?
You're right. I did spend a lot of time on the beaches of St. Simons watching birds come in and trying to figure out their behaviors. The inkling was actually back in the early 90s, and it was more like a big hit on the head side of the head with flocks of hundreds of birds coming in one evening to a little sandspit island off the coast of St. Catherine's Island. And I'd kayaked out there and been doing some photography of the shorebirds, springtime shorebirds, and suddenly had these Whimbrels landing all around me, and it amounted into almost 2,000 birds all in one evening. So it was a fantastic moment for somebody who'd been a naturalist my whole life and had been not seen anything like it. So I knew right away it was something unique, and as the ability to study these birds with better technology, like these small transmitters, came along, then I was working for the Department of Natural Resources in Georgia. And actually, Tim had just gotten on board, so we started the project of understanding what these birds do, both locally and on the coast. We knew there was a very strong tie-in to salt marshes, which we were concerned about from the conservation perspective, and also these small barrier island spits that had been starting to get more and more influence from recreational use. So we took advantage of the technology that was available to us and started tagging birds there, mostly to start building a knowledge gap, both on what the coast of Georgia, how that was important, but also trying to figure out, everything about where these birds were going, where are they nesting, where are they spending the majority of the year during our winter time. So it was a really nice opportunity, and I'm so glad to have Tim on board. Yeah.
Nice. Great, thank you. So Tim, you and Brad actually caught Postel. Not many people get to hold a Whimbrel in their hands. Can you tell us a little bit about what goes into trying to catch a Whimbrel?
Sure. It's quite a bit of a time commitment to catch many birds. Whimbrel tend to be harder than many others to catch. So there's a lot of scouting, figuring out where birds are going throughout the day and where the best place to trap them may be. We have caught Whimbrel using a number of different techniques in Georgia. We started using cannon nets and rocket nets, trying to catch birds that were foraging and roosting. So your approach kind of depends on whether you want to catch a bunch of birds or whether target one bird at a time. We found eventually through a lot of trial and error that we were actually most effective catching individuals with nooses. So this is less dramatic than cannons and rockets and explosions and big nets, but actually more effective time-wise. And we ended up setting up long lines that we would string out through foraging habitat, which was short-cropped marsh grass and salicornia. And every few inches along those lines would be a noose tied with monofilament. And we'd find marshes where a lot of Whimbrel were regularly foraging during the tide cycle, and set up the set up the lines, and then wait for a bird to just step through the noose and entangle its foot. So it's less dramatic, but it ended up being more effective. And that is actually how we caught Postel on St. Simon's, was with a noose line.
That takes a lot of patience, and yeah. So, Tim, why is it important to know how a whimbrel uses one area, like the Georgia coast, but then to also understand the long distance story of how the birds are flying to nesting grounds and then to the tropics in the winter? How is all of that significant to the conservation of this species?
Well, that's a great question, and it really is critical to the conservation and basic understanding of long distance migrants that don't respect any national or state boundaries, that traverse huge swaths of the globe and depend on very different habitats during different times of year. So understanding where they're going and when helps you conserve and protect the essential stopover sites, but it may also open your eyes to certain population bottlenecks that are really important to address if you're hoping to really move the needle on conserving the species. So for instance, through some of this satellite tagging with partners on this call, as well as Center for Conservation Biology, the threat of hunting in the Caribbean really became evident. And so kind of figuring out where they're going, where the key habitats across the hemisphere, and where the conservation bottlenecks across the hemisphere. And then locally, you know, we can only affect so much depending on our jurisdictions and our positions. But a project like this allowed us to really understand the significant importance of both the foraging marshes and very few offshore bar areas on the coast of Georgia that allow us to then do the best we can in the areas that we have control or influence, to ensure that when those whimbrel are in the state of Georgia, particularly for about 6 weeks in spring, that we're doing everything we can to improve their chances of making it to the Arctic successfully.
Nice. Well, thank you both so much. We got to get back to following Postel, so we'll see you again later.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you very much.
All right, so just 2 weeks after Brad and Tim outfitted Postel with that transmitter, Postel left Georgia and flew north nonstop for 5 days and 2,000 miles. After a one-day break at a lake in Ontario, Canada, Postel continues for 2 more days to reach his breeding grounds just north of where the Nelson River meets Hudson Bay. So the breeding season is a really short time, especially on the tundra. So Postel and his mate need to focus on making and guarding their nest. Male and whimbrel both take turns incubating the eggs, and when the eggs hatch, the chicks are walking and feeding themselves within hours. So we are very fortunate today to have Andy Johnson, the videographer for the stunning whimbrel photos you've seen here today, and a powerful visual storyteller. We're going to bring Andy on.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Hey, Andy. Yeah, welcome. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Andy Johnson, and I work currently as a multimedia producer at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in our Center for Conservation Media. And so for me, it's a really exciting place to be working because we follow birds around the world, filming them and you know, helping to support their targeted conservation efforts on the ground. But especially it was a team that had been involved pretty significantly in migratory shorebirds as a topic globally for years. And before I joined the team, I was an undergrad at Cornell and spent a lot of time in that building and studied whimbrels up in Churchill, where the star is on the map now. just a little bit north of the Nelson River where Postel stops. So it was a fun place for me to be, having a little bit of background tracking Whimbrel migration, and now getting to work with telling their stories.
Yeah, it's such an important piece in conservation, is sharing that story with the public and with everyone, so they can better understand these birds, especially when they go to such remote places. So can you tell us a little bit about what goes into capturing a video like that?
Yeah, in that case, on the breeding grounds, a lot of it is relatively straightforward. I mean, it's worth noting too, of course, that at nests, it's a really sensitive place for birds. So, this was during the research I was doing. So it was a balance and a combined opportunity to be, doing the nest checks that we had to do and had the permits for, along with documenting these things. So it's sort of limiting disturbance at the nest. But in the case of the last shot that played, these birds have a really strong drive to go back to incubate those eggs. So you can set up a remote camera that, so you're not there scaring them. You set up a camouflage remote camera and hit play, and they'll come back pretty quickly to the nest. And it's a pretty amazing thing to get to see in an intimate way, where you're setting up a camera low and close. You get a sense for the little micro habitat that they're choosing within the tundra. They're finding just that perfect spot with the right plants and the right topography. It's something I could have done 1,000 times a day forever and not gotten bored. It's just watching those birds come back to their nest and settle down. It's this really guarded, secret moment that they only, you have to be sort of hidden or farther away to get to watch that and sort of share that intimate moment with them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely understand that we don't want to be disturbing birds on nests, for sure, and that this was part of a research project.
Right.
When we talk about the tundra, it seems like and it is such a faraway place. Can you tell us, I've never been to the tundra, can you tell us what it's like to be there?
Yeah, well, my work for this Whimbrel project was in Churchill, Manitoba. And so you're seeing it on the map there. It's the western side of Hudson Bay. Because it's pretty much in the interior of the continent, there's less influence from the ocean. So this is actually a pretty low latitude for a truly Arctic environment. It's one of the most southern pieces of that habitat in North America. But yeah, you get up there and it's right at this transition from the boreal forest, which is, covering that big dark green swath of the continent, northern lower 48 and much of Canada. So you're just kind of emerging out of this, endless sea of conifers and coming out into the open where it's just a little too cold, a little too windy, a little too, cold essentially for all those trees. So it's hard to describe the beautiful draw of the tundra. I mean, it's flat, it's understated, it's simple. I think that's part of it, is everything there is so subtle. You're seeing little differences in the patterns of the little assemblages of wildflower species in one place where it's a little wetter or drier than the other species. And there's just subtle terrain that just draws you to the next horizon. There's just a little rise and you want to see what's beyond that. So it's a captivating place.
It sounds like it.
Balanced by mosquitoes, just too many mosquitoes.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the cost.
But that's what feeds, that bloom of invertebrates is what feeds so many of the shorebirds that go up there to nest.
Absolutely.
So, how do you see the importance of the places that Whimbrel stop on their way to the tundra as having an impact on their nest success during the breeding season?
Yeah, well, these stopover sites, and with Whimbrel in particular, the tracking studies like the satellite tags on Postel and the little light level geolocators that we were putting out on birds in Churchill, which are a lot less detailed data, but Whimbrel are really using very few of these stopover sites. So that place that they do choose to stop on the southeast coast or in the Delmarva Peninsula a little bit further north are super critical to their success on the breeding grounds. And one of the things that our tracking data was showing, and a lot of tracking data has been showing, is that the spring stopovers are actually a lot longer relatively than their fall stopovers. And so it sort of indicates that they're spending this extra amount of time in places like Georgia, South Carolina, Delmarva Peninsula. They're spending a lot of time, more than they need to as an individual adult bird, to make it back to the Arctic. They're spending that extra time building up these nutrient stores because, like you mentioned, the summer in the Arctic is a brief window of opportunity for them to reproduce. So they're carrying those resources up with them to put directly into their eggs as quickly as they can manage. So those fiddler crabs that we saw are essentially being transformed and sent right on their way from Georgia right up to Canada and Alaska.
Yeah.
Pretty cool
Their
connection.
fuel, becoming eggs, becoming chicks, becoming the next generation.
Exactly. Yeah. Really fundamental level of importance to just make more Whimbrel.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that window into the breeding area. Really appreciate it. We'll see you in a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, the breeding season is such a short, really important time in the annual cycle of these birds. So talking about short time, it's just 2 months after arriving that Postel is heading south again. So his young will make their own way south on their own migration just a few weeks to a month after Postel. And in just 5 days, Postel flies south to the coast of South Carolina, and resting only for 1 day on the eastern shore of Virginia. Once landing in South Carolina, Postel is within the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, and this has been a wizard site since 1991. The beautiful coast of South Carolina is rich with beaches and a mix of natural marshes and man-made wetlands. And just like Postel, Brad Wynn and I spent some time in coastal South Carolina through our Habitats for Shorebirds project. So in 2015, we held 2 workshops right where Postel had landed on his southward migration. And our workshops were attended by state and federal wildlife professionals and land managers who oversee many thousands of acres of coastline and wetlands. By bringing people together to learn about shorebird ecology, conservation, and habitat management techniques through these workshops, we're able to help improve habitats and support healthier shorebird populations. And while the people that attend our workshops are different at every site, they speak many different languages, they're in many different countries, but there's one common theme, and that's that they're all focused on addressing and reducing the threats to shorebirds to help improve the places that they rely on. So just less than 3 years after the South Carolina workshop, participants and partners banded together to actually expand the Cape Romaine wizard site, nearly doubling it in size. This effort helped to ensure that Whimbrels and many thousands of other shorebirds could count on an even larger part of that South Carolina coast. That expanded wizard site, the Cape Romaine Santee Delta region, now covers over 100,000 acres along 50 miles of the South Carolina coastline. Felicia Sanders she's a biologist and a partner with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and she described the site expansion that it represents an awareness and a pride in the surrounding communities of people standing together for shorebirds. And since we're here with Postel in South Carolina, we'll take a break to meet with Abby Sterling. She is my colleague at Manomet, and she works in the Georgia Bight. Hey, Abby.
Hi, Monica.
Welcome.
Thank you. This is great.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself and where you work?
Yeah, so I'm Abby Sterling, and like Monica said, I work for Manomet, but I'm based down here in the Southeast. I'm located in Georgia, and I work on the Georgia Bight Shorebird Conservation Initiative.
Very cool. So let's see, it's really interesting that Postel stopped here in South Carolina on his southbound migration rather than going back to Georgia where we first found him. But we see that in shorebird species where southbound and northbound migration paths are different. What does that mean for shorebird conservation?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that we see with these migrations is birds have these key rest stops, just like we have when we're on a big road trip or something like that, where we need places to stop and refuel and rest up. And so, you know, there's a lot of different factors that drive these routes and these stopover locations, whether it's weather patterns or food resources. And so for Whimbrels like Postel, who's in South Carolina and Georgia, one of the things that we've talked about a lot is these very abundant food resources like fiddler crabs. And so although there's a lot of different factors that influence migration, we do see that there's a pretty standard route that they take once they figure it out, and there's a lot of site faithfulness to those key places. So the fact that Postel comes to South Carolina in the fall is kind of, that's maybe his favorite spot on that journey. And so when we think about that in the big picture for shorebird conservation, you know, what does that mean, right? With birds that are using huge geographic swaths, this big round trip, not linear, it's kind of almost like a loop in a way. And so we have to sort of take that into account when we're trying to think of shorebird conservation, and really the importance of building these broad regional partnerships that aren't dependent on geographic boundaries, right? Because birds like Postel is not tied to specific boundaries. And so he's really using the whole entire southeast on this migration, both during his southbound and his northbound migration. And in the southeast, we see, like everyone has talked about here, and you've seen in these incredible photos, just these really expansive salt marshes, these important remote bars that the birds are roosting on. And so we need all of these pieces of the puzzle to be protected through partnerships. And so you mentioned the wizard sites are very important when we think about the whole Georgia Bight region. We actually have 3 wizard sites included. And so that's really just highlighting how important this broad area is for these birds. And so even though they have specific favorite places within the region, it's important to think broadly about conservation in the Southeast.
Right, yeah, that's great. That's a big and important, clearly an important area for shorebirds. How do your efforts in the Georgia Bight Shorebird Conservation Initiative and in that region, how do they benefit shorebirds like Whimbrel that are coming through this area in such large numbers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are very lucky in the Bight. It's critically important, you know, sort of unparalleled in terms of birds using it throughout the entire year, not just Whimbrel. Mm-hmm. We're an important place during the winter for birds and during the nesting season for shorebirds. And during the spring and fall migration, both, which is significant. And so with this initiative, you know, we have the opportunity to really try to increase awareness for the region as a whole, and sort of increase the identity of understanding that this is an entire place that the birds are using, and increase education and outreach, and then also build these partnerships to standardize coastal management, so that we really don't have these boundaries, since the birds aren't constrained by these boundaries. And so with this initiative, we were able to really work across borders, you know, between islands. The coast is scattered with these barrier islands that are really important, between agencies working with all sorts of different partners, like nonprofits like 100 Miles and the Nature Conservancy, state partners like Tim and Felicia, federal partners, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all of these different groups that have really a strong legacy of shorebird conservation. You know, it's not news to anyone that works in this area that it's important. And so what we're working on with this project is to try to increase collaboration and capacity so that we can make sure that we can protect these important places for Whimbrels and all the other shorebirds that depend on them.
Yeah, it's like you have 3 wizard sites in just the Georgia Bight, and then that rolls up to all of the wizard sites across the Americas, and they're all linked together and all connected by these birds. So super cool. Thank you so much. I know this was a short visit, but we're going to get back to Postel and get on the move. So thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Monica. Yep.
All right, so back to Postel. So Postel was in South Carolina, and from the safety of that coast, he embarked out over the open ocean to fly a remarkable 3,400 miles nonstop southward until he arrives on the coast of Brazil. So imagine right now, the boreal winter is freezing in the north, and Postel is feasting on tropical invertebrates on the beaches and mud flats and in the mangrove forests of São Marcos Bay, Brazil. Here, he's happily waited out the northern winter for 7 months. So here we get to meet another biologist at Manomet, Alan Neidel. We'll bring him in.
All right. I'm Monica.
Alan.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, welcome. Can you introduce yourself and tell us
Sure.
a little bit about yourself?
I work with Monica at Manomet as a staff biologist. And believe it or not, it's been almost 10 years since my first stint with Manomet when I joined a large team working on the Gulf Coast after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Now I work with Brad, based out of Massachusetts, and a lot of my work focuses on Whimbrels and working to grow our shorebird research within the Northeast and translating that throughout the hemisphere. Related to this story, I've also gone on loan to help some other organizations do work in the last couple of years, and this included a couple trips to South America, assisting with New Jersey Audubon and Tulane research with shorebirds on the coast of Brazil and in the Suriname area. And as looking forward to sharing some of that expertise with you guys.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear all of these different linkages and partnerships, because that's really what it takes to do all of this work, especially across such a large landscape. So let's see, Postel spends more than half of the year in northern Brazil. Can you describe this part of the South American coast to us?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that everyone should pull up a map after this and look and see how long and extensive this coastline is, stretching from the Guianas all the way along the Brazilian coastline. And I can speak to my experience in a couple spots. I've visited both on the north and south side of the mouth of the Amazon River, and it's a very remote coastline. To get to some of the spots where we're working with shorebirds, it took a 6-hour car ride from the closest city, followed by a 6-hour boat ride. And a lot of these, the only people living along these coastlines are very remote communities that often do not have cars leading to them, no roads, and are entirely focused on boat transit and fishing and hunting for the most part in a subsistence sort of fashion. And approaching the coastline, it's kind of a transition from a traditional sort of jungle image that a lot of people have, and then into very large mangrove forests, and not necessarily little shrub-like mangroves, but we're talking mangrove trees that are 100 feet tall and have their own subset of songbirds that live in them. And then after that, you're going out into these huge mud flats that extend out for miles due to the up to 21-foot tides that will just reveal these enormous mud flats that are covered by lots of birds.
Wow, that sounds pretty cool. So for many migrating shorebirds, that whole northern coast of South America, like you mentioned, Guyana, French Guiana, Suriname, Brazil, these are the first places that shorebirds land during their migration south. And hundreds of thousands of these birds are spending the better part of the year there. So it could be argued that this is really the true home for these birds, that the trip north to the breeding grounds is really just sort of a series of stops to and from the breeding area. But what do you think makes this area so important to shorebirds?
Well, a couple things. I think if you pull up a map after this and look at the coastline of Brazil, you'll see that from far away it looks like a straight line, but in fact the coastline is very sinuous, kind of like the fjord sort of concept that you see, where there's lots of undulations along the coastline, which really creates what would be basically extends the amount of coastline by up to 3 times just by the amount of surface area there. And part of that also makes the coastline very remote. So there's a lot of coastline that's largely remote, and to host so many different species of shorebirds, it's not just Whimbrels, it's black-bellied plovers, it's willets, and lots of semi-palmated sandpipers. You need a lot of diverse microhabitats within that coastline. And so you need mudflats, you need mangrove. And in this photo you see here that I took on the Brazilian coastline, that's a large flock of roosting Whimbrel, and you can see in the background these really tall mangrove forests, and actually kind of an entryway into one of those sort of inlets that I was describing. And one of the big players here, which kind of blew my mind but it actually makes a lot of sense, is that being positioned near the mouth of the Amazon River, all the sediment that's basically draining out of the entirety of the South American Amazon basin is going out of the mouth of the Amazon and spreading out into the ocean. And due to the currents after it's out into the ocean, it actually sweeps out and then back in north of the mouth of the Amazon, deposits all this rich sediment back onto these mudflats, and just creates this very rich substrate that produces crabs, and then also the biofilm that the little peeps are feeding in. So it supports all sorts of shorebirds that all have slightly different requirements.
Yeah. Wow.
I will say that part of what makes this place so great for shorebirds also makes it very challenging to do shorebird research, because there's no way to drive there. There's a lot of limited infrastructure. And so, whereas WISRN has done a great job in identifying some of the hot spots, some of these areas within this coastline that are particularly productive, and now we have evolution of remote tracking technology like we've seen with Postel, where we've been able to identify locations where these birds are using even without having to be there on the ground. There's still a lot of unknown answers, and to help answer those, we're working with a lot of partner organizations that are actually based in South America, one of which we were hoping to have a member join us, but she was unable to, but that's Save Brazil, that's working on trying to develop funding and working with local stakeholders to implement shorebird conservation action down there and further our understanding of that area.
Yeah, Save is a great partner for sure. Wow. Well, it's really interesting to hear from you about that northern coast of South America, and especially the linkage with the Amazon River. That's so incredible, right? So the Amazon is what's helping feed shorebirds.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, we're going to get back to Postel's migration. So thanks so much, Alan, for joining us, and we'll see you in a little bit.
My pleasure.
All right. So now that winter in the north is over, what is next for Postel? The breeding season is beckoning him north again, but after leaving Brazil and starting his northbound migration, where do you think he went? Well, he flew straight back to the same salt marsh in the Georgia Barrier Islands where he was originally tagged, to fatten up again on fiddler crabs. You see in this photo, there is a Whimbrel with an antenna that's sticking up at about a 45-degree angle. That is Postel. He was photographed by a biologist in Georgia, Fletcher Smith, during a rare chance encounter. Tim and Brad tracked Postel for over 1,300 days until the transmitter stopped sending a signal, which can happen for a variety of reasons, but maybe because the technology stopped functioning. They don't last forever. But over the course of those 3.5 years, Postel returned to the same 4 sites every year. Postel was not only site faithful, but he was dependent on these sites. If just one of these 4 places were to disappear or to be altered, it's likely he might not survive his journey. So through Postel's migration story, we met just some of the people that are working to study and protect whimbrels across their life cycle. Tracking these birds and their astonishing annual journeys deepens our understanding of their needs, and it helps strengthen our efforts to protect them. So while Postel is no longer transmitting, research on whimbrels and efforts to conserve this species and other shorebird species continue. In fact, as Alan had alluded to, Manomet has a tracking program with 2 transmitted birds right now. So for that, we're going to tune back in. We're going to bring Brad and Alan back in to hear a little bit more about that tracking program that's currently active. Hey, both. Hi, Brad and Alan.
Howdy.
Hi, Monica.
All right. Welcome back. All right. So, Brad, let's see. You and Alan are keeping an eye on 2 transmitted birds right now. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's so important to keep and continue tracking these whimbrels?
Yeah, and Alan alluded to it a little while ago. We have been, for the last 10 years, working with many partners. What was the Canadian Wildlife Service, Center for Conservation Biology in Virginia with Brian Watts and Fletcher Smith then. Fletcher's now working for Tim actually in Georgia. So very dedicated crew that have been following, putting all the pieces together to understand the broader migration ecology and ecology of these birds on the ground, to try to build essentially our knowledge base of whimbrel as a population in the eastern part of the Americas, but also to understand what it takes to be other shorebirds as well. So we're using whimbrels as a surrogate or an ambassador to figure out where some more of those important stopover sites are. So back in the 80s, when the whole idea of monitoring or finding these special sites evolved, Manomet started the International Shorebird Survey. It continues today to try to find the special places that these birds go to. We're still very active in that effort. The Western Hemisphere network that you described, also very active. And then we're putting this additional layer of understanding with individual birds like Postel and other whimbrels to use and to find those locations that are important to these birds. So we have learned a great deal about adult whimbrels. And so our main focus right now is trying to put the pieces together to learn more about what juvenile birds do coming south for their first flight. We also are interested in understanding additional populations of these birds. We know that now there are 3 breeding areas for them across Canada and into Alaska actually, and we're on the verge of understanding that there's actually a 4th based on some of the tracking that we've done. So putting all the pieces together for both adults and juveniles is really what's continuing to drive us and to help us build this broader base of knowledge so that we can apply it and know where to apply conservation dollars most effectively. I think that this is an opportunity to know that we can go to Brazil and work with our partners down there and understand the very specific areas that are hosting large numbers of whimbrels and other shorebirds. And it's not just all of the Brazil coast, as Alan indicated. There are very definite higher use pockets that we're really interested in getting into and understanding how to protect those sites. So it's a great project. We tag very small numbers of birds and end up getting 3 or 4 years of data, hopefully from an individual bird, and we've learned something new with each bird. So it's been a very gratifying and interesting project. And now we're working in Massachusetts, right outside Manomet's front door in Outer Cape, where there's a definite, very significant staging area in the Outer Cape, and we're trying to put the pieces together for how the birds use Cape Cod. and outer New England actually, and then where those birds go and where they nest. So it's another layer of understanding. So it's great.
I love thinking about Whimbrel, these tagged Whimbrels, as being our ambassadors, right? They're ambassadors to tell the story of their migration, but also to teach us about even other shorebirds. It's great.
People get very excited about knowing that they're hosting, so to speak, hosting one or many of these birds in their area. And when we put the pieces together of their life history, it becomes very exciting and builds pride within individuals and organizations that we work with. And even communities at the community level, we have been able to get a lot of feedback from people that that live in the areas where these birds go. And when we tell them the story of the birds that they know for a very short part of the year, for instance, in Georgia, it's 4 weeks or 5 weeks the birds are there, and then they're really pretty much gone the rest of the year. It's very gratifying to see the excitement and the pride that builds from that.
Nice. Alan, so there's Sachem was outfitted with a transmitter in 2017, and Ahanu was outfitted in 2018, and both are still being tracked right now, right?
Yes.
What are you most excited about to learn from these birds? Like, what can these individuals teach us?
Well, both of those birds were tagged in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and from the first day that they're tagged, they immediately start telling us about how they're using Cape Cod, which in itself is what shorebird biologists like to refer to as a terminal staging area, which means it's an area that's used for up to a month prior to one of their large subsequent flights that might be several thousand miles. And we have learned that the Whimbrels that are on the Cape, the 6 that we've tagged so far, have all departed the Cape and flown nonstop over the Atlantic Ocean to either into the Caribbean or the north coast of South America. But even before they do that flight, we're learning about their local resource uses on the Cape, where they're roosting, where they're feeding, whether they're using multiple roost sites, and the relationship between those 2 locations. And it's particularly interesting in Cape Cod, which is such a kind of restricted area that's heavily populated and has a limited amount of resources available to the birds. There's just a few kind of relic marshes left on Cape Cod that are suitable to Whimbrel. So it's a really great study area. And once they depart the Cape, they're teaching us similar sort of things elsewhere on their migratory cycles. Sachem, which is a juvenile individual that was tagged in 2017, has spent all those nearly 1,000 days since that day in Venezuela, which is something that we would have suspected would have happened because we think that juvenile shorebirds, especially Whimbrels, might spend several years on their wintering grounds prior to traveling northward to breed for the first time. But this is the first sort of evidence of this kind to confirm that. And Ahanu, which was tagged as an adult in 2018 on Cape Cod, actually flew and wintered in the same bay, the Bay of San Marcos in Brazil, the same bay that Postel, who we were learning about earlier, also spent the winter. So even though they came from 2 different locations, and Ahanu never spent any time in Georgia, both these birds are using the same bay in Brazil. So that might even further highlight the importance of that location. And as you alluded to, Monica, each one of these stories is a very tangible, easy way to introduce the public to the story of a shorebird with an individual that they might even actually see in person if they come out to our field site on Cape Cod. They know that individual and can travel with it while never having to leave behind their computer, which we're really enjoying being able to do now that we're restricted to our offices a lot, that we're still being able to track these birds from behind our computer and get some semblance of field work done.
Yeah, watching these birds migrate as we're all in, many of us are in quarantine, has been really inspiring. And I actually think that migration is one of the most inspiring things on the planet. And really the more we learn, the more it helps us inform conservation actions and keeping those hearts and wings beating in the sky. So thank you both very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Great job, Monica.
Thanks, Monica. Great job.
Thanks. So as you've seen here, it will take, and it is taking, a very large network working across a huge geography to meet the conservation needs of Whimbrels and also other shorebirds. It takes many committed partners like those that you've met here today and that have been mentioned, that are all working together to keep these migrations going. Shorebirds like Postel, they know where to go, but it's up to us to make sure that the habitats that they're counting on are there when they arrive. So thanks everybody. That was the story and the interaction. We hope you enjoyed it. There's actually 2 other Whimbrel migration stories in Whimbrels on the Wing, that online story. And if you're interested in, if you're interested in hearing one of those stories, let us know in that follow-up survey. But now we'd like to open it up to your questions. So I believe that you've been entering some questions in the chat box, and you can ask some now, and Abby will queue them up for us. So we're going to bring everybody back on.
Fantastic. This is great. There's been some really good questions coming in, and some of them were scattered throughout, so we'll just kind of touch back on some of those. And I may direct some questions for the people, but maybe everyone feel free to chime in, you know, if you have a particular story or input that you want. And you can keep the questions coming, and we'll try and multitask as well. One of the early questions that we got from John that we touched on a little bit was just the question about subsistence hunting of Whimbrel as a mortality factor. And I think that's an interesting threat to their life history and to many shorebirds. And so maybe if someone's got some insight in that and would like to talk about it, maybe Brad, you would want to tee that one up.
Sure, I can speak briefly about that. Well, 2 things. We know about more about subsistence and recreational hunting actually than we did 8 or 9 years ago, based on 2 Whimbrels tagged by Center for Conservation Biology in Virginia that ended up being killed on the same day on Guadalupe Island. And it really took the lid off of our interest on the pressures of hunting in the Caribbean and on the coast of South America. I think the recreational hunting aspect has been, it's a much easier lift as far as understanding how to allay some of the pressures there on particularly sensitive species. The subsistence hunting that's going on is a much harder one to get a handle on. We think it's quite widespread across countries in the north coast of South America. There are regulations in place in some countries, and there are other countries with a total lack of regulation, but there seems to be, when there's protein needs of local communities, it's not just the shorebirds that are getting killed, it's wildlife in general. So it's a very tricky scenario, very hard to address without knowing the full scope of it. So the bottom line with subsistence hunting is we're working with partners and with everything, Canadian Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working very diligently trying to understand the impacts both from recreational and subsistence hunting, but much easier to go to the organized hunting clubs in some of the countries and on some of the islands and start working with them to foster a better understanding of what they are hunting actually, adding biology and part of our work tracking these birds, the knowledge we're gaining goes to the people who are hunting them in those regions. So it's it's added benefit, and it has helped to allay some of the pressures on some of the species for sure.
Great.
One thought to add to some of that too, I think, and Brad mentioned the distinction between recreational and subsistence hunting, and obviously the question is about subsistence hunting. But I think it's important as much as there is some data, and there's also a lack of data in terms of like flyway scale, how much is being really taken, how much do we know is being taken versus how much is taken under the radar. I think it's just important to keep in mind the threats from hunting as a big umbrella threat relative to a lot of the other threats that shorebirds are facing. I mean, just keeping it in perspective against things like habitat loss and the multiple indirect effects of climate change. And also just thinking about, especially when it comes to subsistence hunting, that there's a sense that there's an importance to finding the common ground with other human communities. One of the things that shorebirds do best is connecting human communities. So there's human communities that are relying on shorebirds as a resource for subsistence. There's an angle there to look at the common ground in everyone having a shared stake in maintaining healthy populations of shorebirds.
Very true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that ties in with a couple of other questions in terms of thinking about threats, and particularly, you mentioned climate change. And so, we see changes in the Arctic in nesting areas, and we also see issues of things like sea level rise. And so we had a couple questions about climate change and sea level rise. And so I think we could touch on it maybe from the wintering ground perspective, but maybe also touch on it a little bit from the Arctic perspective. Anybody want to take a stab at talking about that?
I can take a stab on sea level rise when it comes to the eastern coast of the US a little bit, and what we're doing about it. Certainly a huge problem for the wildlife that lives right on that edge of water and land. And we are again working, trying to infuse some best management practices into the coastal engineering practices of the authorities that manage such things along the US coast. And I've had some success and interest in creating and maintaining some of the key habitats that are being eroded and have been lost or in the process of being lost with increasing storms. And one of those projects or interests is coming to bear right now, actually on the Georgia coast. The Army Corps of Engineers is interested in helping to establish a barrier island based on our interest in rebuilding or creating shorebird habitat. So it's fairly exciting. So we are working on it from that angle. While climate change can be overwhelming, there are avenues to work successfully state by state. We think that state implementation of conservation efforts is the way to go. So there's some success there. And I'll leave it at that for somebody else to talk about maybe things going on in the Arctic. Andy, if you've got some insight on what you're seeing there, or somebody else. Alan spent a lot of time up in the Arctic as well, so Alan might have something to say about that.
Yeah, Alan, I would kick sort of like mismatch and insect stuff maybe, or anything else you think of to you. But one quick thought I had on the spring migration is I remember being struck by learning that in sort of the process of analyzing some of this tracking data, looking back and seeing before individual tracking studies that Whimbrel in particular, were basically flying over the Great Lakes as they're on their way from the southeast coast to the subarctic or the Arctic breeding grounds. Their peak numbers were basically May 24th for like the last 60 years, and that date has sort of always been the same, which I think is something interesting to just sort of keep in mind. I don't know if others have more up-to-date data or examples from other species, but it's something to think about as we see, spring happen earlier over that same time period, and we see Whimbrel populations, at least in the Atlantic flyway, really sticking to a date that seems to be pretty deeply ingrained in them.
Yeah, definitely. That you hit it right in the wheelhouse. With departure in Georgia, it's really between about 2022 and by 27th of May, they're gone. It's hard to find a single Whimbrel there. So there's a very distinct departure time. And in my years there, I documented some of that. So you're right. They're quite date faithful. Right.
Yeah.
Well, then there is the piece of the potential mismatch of the blooms of invertebrates in the Arctic and shorebirds sort of not arriving on time to be able to access those resources, because that's really what they're getting there for. And if those become misaligned, then shorebirds won't be able to, fuel themselves, and their young won't have things to eat. So that also needs to align. So when these birds are moving across such long distances, there are a lot of things that need to line up along the way. And then they hit the Arctic, and that's sort of the crux of that migration piece.
Yeah, fiddler crabs. We mentioned fiddler crabs are tied right into salt marshes, and if salt marshes erode, as they have been in many places, Fish and Wildlife Service is focusing on loss of salt marshes. So another thing to consider. But yeah, fiddler crabs are still, on the brighter side. They're uber abundant, and so as far as staging areas in the southeastern U.S. and actually in the way south along Massachusetts coast, fiddler crabs are gangbuster available for them still. So trying to swing it to the bright side here, Monica, a little bit, but they're
Thank you.
We did have a couple questions come in about what birds are eating specifically where. So we had a few people ask about places that are really good to see Whimbrels in Cape Cod, and another question about specifically what Whimbrels are eating in Brazil. So
both of those sound like Alan's wheelhouse, I'd say.
Yeah, I could tackle those. Starting out with wondering where you can see Whimbrels on Cape Cod. There's a couple spots, sadly just a couple spots that are really good for them, even though I think historically they were probably much more widespread. The area around Wellfleet Bay is very productive for Whimbrel, and it's where we focus a lot of our work. There's a Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary run by Mass Audubon is a great spot, as well as there's a causeway called Lieutenant Island Causeway that if you drive along that mostly during the fall. It's interesting about Whimbrels, you probably saw on this map that they do these kind of circular migrations where they're not going a linear line on the highway back and forth. And so in Massachusetts, they're mainly just coming through during the fall. And so anywhere from July to September. And you could also go down into the Chatham area to a place called Forest Beach and poke around the little small relic salt marsh there as well. When in Massachusetts, they're eating from what we've seen, they're eating almost exclusively fiddler crabs, which are very abundant in the salt marsh that they feed in. And similarly in South America, to the best of my knowledge, they're eating mostly fiddler crabs and mangrove crabs. They're feeding among the mangroves and actually enter into the mangrove forest. And so actually when I was down there, you'd often Whimbrels would be a herd only bird because they'd be in the mangroves calling. And these mangroves are these tall forests. So it's kind of a bizarre shorebird experience. And then there's spotted sandpipers walking along the branches of the mangroves. It's kind of a crazy experience. And then in the Arctic and also in the Canadian Maritimes, on southbound migration. They're eating lots of berries. There's been a lot of work with some partner organizations and the Canadian Maritimes looking at the blueberry farms there and the relationship between whimbrels feeding on blueberries and farmers being concerned that the whimbrels are depleting their blueberries. And there's been some work trying to relay to them the actual impact that whimbrels are having, and that it's actually quite small compared to the economic costs that they might imagine. So it's really a very varied diet, and a lot of the berries they're eating are kind of prostrate shrubs that are actually growing pretty close to the ground because it's such a windswept area in the far north. Yeah.
That's a good point about the blueberries. That one's it's really interesting to think about those birds eating berries. And one of the other birds in our Whimbrels on the Wing story is named Lamech, and one of the other tracked birds, and that bird moves through blueberry fields during its migration. And so if you're interested in hearing more about that, we might be doing a panel or another future story about that.
We had an interesting question come in that y'all may have some thoughts on. Our participant said that they always thought most shorebird migration in the spring was more accelerated than in the fall. And in reference to some of the things we talked about earlier, where we talked about whimbrels spending a lot of time on spring migration, they asked if that pattern is unique to whimbrels, or if that's a little more typical than we previously kind of thought.
I can take a shot at it a little bit. It varies, like most things in nature, it varies, but with whimbrels, there is definitely a spring staging period, and then again on the southbound migration, a southbound staging area too. And both of these are birds are hitting resource-rich sites that they can re-nourish themselves, put on a lot of weight. You know, we can watch on outer Cape Cod these juveniles that come in very thin in late August and early September, and by the end of September, they are these robust, rounded out birds that have lots of fat and lots of muscle they've built up. And so it's really neat to see the changeover. And for those who had the question of Cape Cod viewing sites, go in the end of August, early September, and then come back and see what those birds look like a month later. So to Andy's point, there are some that do a very quick southbound trip, and the northbound trip for many of these shorebirds tends to be during periods of time when there's still severe weather up north. So they definitely are coming in and getting food resources in the south or along the coastal areas that are much more temperate, and they're bulking up, pausing before they jump up to the Arctic, because boreal north into Arctic is still usually under snow and ice. So there's that slowdown. And on the way south, they could be coming a lot faster south because they're seeking the food resources that they have gotten to know over the years. We think we've seen them to be very, very site faithful, and we think the juveniles coming south learn where those resources are on their first flight. So I don't know if that.
There's one. Oh, Andy, do you want to go?
Oh, I was just going to add a little bit to that, just that, Whimbrel, one of the things that's somewhat unique in them, as far as I understand, is that they're holding wintering territories much more than a lot of other shorebirds that are in larger flocks out on mudflats. So there's in some ways an extra incentive for them to be hurrying down in the fall to potentially secure one of those territories for a long period, as we've said, more than half the year, of having a productive territory on the wintering grounds. And then the other thought is just that they're a larger shorebird. So that I think typically the older literature is, and for other smaller shorebirds, is indicating that a lot of birds are rushing up to the breeding grounds in spring, gathering nutrients on the breeding grounds in spring. And Whimbrel, I think, are sort of on that slightly other end of the spectrum, with a strategy called capital breeding, where they're bringing those nutrients with them to the breeding grounds. So there's still certainly a rush in the spring to get north, and that's why we see that really narrow window that Brad's seeing from departures from the spring. They have to get up to the breeding grounds really quickly, but they're also just leaving the wintering grounds earlier to have enough time to gather all those nutrients on the East Coast.
Yeah, and the one additional piece, and I think all of our answers sort of really accentuate the fact that there are a lot of, nature is complicated. But another piece is that on the fall migration, adults actually leave the breeding grounds first, and then juveniles follow later. And so that creates this sort of perception of fall being a really long window, fall migration being a big window of time, because you have adults moving through, and then a few weeks later you have juveniles moving through. And so it also looks a bit longer too because of that. Cool. I think that might be wrapping up our questions. Is that right, Abby?
Yeah, I think we've gotten really through most of the questions, I think, and yep, as Ellen just put in the chat box here, if you had a question that we didn't get to, feel free, check out our websites, or get in touch. Ellen's provided his email address here, so you should be able to get a great response from Ellen very quickly.
Great. All right. So thank you all very much for joining us. I hope that you were able to answer your questions, that we've provided some websites here if you want to follow up with any of our organizations, and perhaps maybe some of you have tried the QR code to get the link for more Whimbrel tracking at Manomet. And I believe that Chris will be following up with a follow-up survey to get your feedback about the webinar and see how that went.
That's right, Monica. We'll be sending that follow-up email here in just a few days with a link to view and share the recorded webinar if you want. And also, if I could just say, I know a lot of you that have joined us today are donors. I just want to thank you so much for supporting Manomet and our work, and let you know how much we really do appreciate that. If you're not a current Manomet supporter, we'd love to have you. You can visit our website at manomet.org, and we would really appreciate your support. And again, thank you all so much for being part of today's special webinar. And to our panelists, goodness, thank you so much for all of your time and efforts on this. This was just really terrific. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris,
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Thanks, Manomet.
But
Bye all.
thanks. Bye all.
Thanks, Al.